I still remember the sting of my father's words that morning. "Sarah, you'll sit in the back row with the other families. This ceremony isn't about you." His dismissive tone cut deeper than any training injury I'd ever endured. 28 years old, and he still saw me as the little girl who used to play dress-up in his old army fatigues, not as Captain Sarah Mitchell of the 82nd Airborne Division. The base auditorium was buzzing with anticipation. Families filled every seat, their faces glowing with pride as they waited for the ceremony to begin. My father, Colonel James Mitchell, retired but still carrying himself like he owned every room he entered, had secured front-row seats for himself and my stepmother. Meanwhile, I found myself relegated to the very back, squeezed between a nervous-looking private's girlfriend and an elderly woman clutching a tissue box. "This is ridiculous," I muttered under my breath, adjusting my dress blues for what felt like the 100th time. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart, and my own father couldn't even acknowledge my presence at what was supposed to be one of the most important days of my military career. The irony wasn't lost on me. Growing up, I'd worshipped my father's military legacy. Our house was a shrine to his decorated career, commendations covering the walls, his old uniform displayed in a glass case, stories of his heroism told at every family gathering. But when I announced my intention to enlist right out of college, his reaction was ice-cold disappointment. "The military is no place for my daughter," he'd said, as if my gender somehow disqualified me from serving the country I loved. 8 years later, nothing had changed. Every promotion, every deployment, every moment of growth in my career was met with the same indifferent shrug. It was as if he'd written me off the moment I chose to follow in his footsteps, instead of becoming the lawyer or doctor he'd envisioned. The ceremony was about to begin, and I could see him in the front row, chest puffed out with pride. Not for me, but for the institution he'd once been part of. My stepmother leaned over and whispered something in his ear, probably asking why I wasn't sitting with them. I watched him glance back briefly, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found mine. For a split second, I thought I saw something soften in his expression, but then he turned away just as quickly. That's when I noticed him, a man in an impeccable uniform sitting 3 rows ahead of me. Even from behind, there was something commanding about his posture, something that made other officers straighten their spines when they passed by. The stars on his shoulders caught the light, and I felt my stomach drop. A general. What was a general doing at what I'd assumed was a routine base ceremony? The whispers started spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Is that General Morrison? What's he doing here? This must be bigger than we thought." My palms began to sweat, and suddenly the back row felt even more isolating. Whatever was about to happen, I was watching it from the cheap seats, while my father sat front and center, completely unaware that his daughter might be more involved in today's events than he'd ever imagined. The base commander stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored today by the presence of General Patricia Morrison, who has traveled here for a very special recognition ceremony." My heart stopped. This wasn't just any ceremony. This was something that had drawn a 3-star general to our small base. And somehow, sitting in that back row, I had the sinking feeling that my father's dismissive attitude was about to backfire in the most public way possible. The general rose from her seat, and I could see my father's confused expression as he tried to understand why this ceremony had suddenly become so significant. As General Morrison made her way to the podium, I felt my chest tighten with a familiar anxiety. 3 months ago, I'd been part of a classified operation in Syria, a joint task force mission that had gone sideways in the worst possible way. Our intelligence had been compromised, and what should have been a routine extraction turned into a nightmare that left 2 soldiers critically wounded and our entire unit pinned down for 18 hours. The official reports were sanitized, classified, buried under layers of military bureaucracy. My father knew nothing about it, just like he knew nothing about most of my deployments. To him, I was still playing soldier, still the daughter who disappointed him by choosing combat boots over courtrooms. But I remembered every detail of that night in Aleppo, the way the bullets had shattered the windows of our safe house, the blood pooling beneath Sergeant Rodriguez as I dragged him to cover, the impossible choice I'd had to make when our extraction helicopter couldn't land: stay with the wounded and risk losing everyone, or lead a dangerous nighttime evacuation through hostile territory. I'd chosen to move, against direct orders from command. I'd made the call to evacuate our position, carrying Rodriguez on my back for 3 miles through enemy-controlled streets while coordinating with local assets I wasn't supposed to contact. It was a decision that could have ended my career, court-martialed me for insubordination, or worse, gotten everyone killed. Instead, it had saved 7 lives. General Morrison's voice cut through my memories. Today, we recognize extraordinary courage under fire. The kind of leadership that emerges not from rank or protocol, but from an unwavering commitment to leave no soldier behind. My father was leaning forward now, probably wondering why he hadn't been briefed about this ceremony. The irony was suffocating. He'd spent my entire military career treating my service like an embarrassing phase I'd eventually outgrow, never bothering to ask about my deployments, my missions, or the soldiers under my command. The recipient of today's Silver Star demonstrated tactical brilliance and moral courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the general continued. When conventional extraction became impossible, this officer made the difficult decision to improvise, ultimately saving the lives of 6 fellow soldiers and 2 civilian contractors. The room was completely silent now. I could see my father's confusion deepening as he tried to piece together why this ceremony required a general's presence. My stepmother was whispering urgently in his ear, probably asking the same questions that were written across his face. But I knew. The investigation into our Syria operation had been ongoing for months. Every decision I'd made that night had been scrutinized, analyzed, debated by officers who'd never been in combat. Some had called my actions heroic. Others had questioned whether I'd endangered the mission by deviating from protocol. Apparently, the review board had reached their conclusion. This officer's actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service, General Morrison continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. In a moment when following orders might have meant catastrophic loss of life, they chose to trust their training, their instincts, and their unwavering commitment to their fellow soldiers. My hands were shaking now. 3 months of uncertainty, of wondering whether my career was over, of living with my father's continued disappointment while carrying the weight of classified heroism he'd never understand. The general paused, her gaze settling on the back of the room. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, would you please come forward?" The auditorium erupted in whispers and turning heads. I felt every eye in the room searching for me, including my father's. For the first time in 8 years, Colonel James Mitchell was about to discover that his daughter wasn't playing soldier, after all. She was one. The walk to the front of the auditorium felt like crossing a minefield. Every step echoed in the sudden silence, and I could feel hundreds of eyes tracking my movement. My father's face had gone completely white, his mouth slightly open as if he couldn't process what he was seeing. The confusion in his expression was almost painful to watch. This was his daughter, the one he'd dismissed as playing dress-up, being called forward by a 3-star general. As I approached the front row, I had to pass directly by my father's seat. For a split second, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine shock mixed with what might have been the beginning of recognition. Not recognition of me as his daughter, but recognition of me as a soldier, his soldier daughter. "Sir?" I said quietly as I passed, giving him the slightest nod. It was the first time I'd addressed him with military courtesy instead of calling him Dad, and the formality seemed to hit him like a physical blow. The general was waiting for me at the podium, her expression warm but professional. Up close, I could see the weight of command in her eyes, the same look I'd seen in my father's face during his stiff years. But there was something else there. Respect. the kind of respect I'd been craving from my father for 8 years. "Captain Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "Your actions in Syria on March 15th exemplify the finest traditions of the United States Army. When faced with an impossible situation, you chose courage over protocol, leadership over self-preservation." I could hear my father's sharp intake of breath behind me. Syria. The word hung in the air like a revelation. I'd never told him about Syria, about any of my deployments, really. Our conversations had become so strained over the years that I'd stopped trying to share my military experiences with him. He'd made it clear that my service was a disappointment to him, so I'd learned to keep that part of my life separate. But now, standing at attention while General Morrison detailed the events of that night, the compromised intelligence, the wounded soldiers, the impossible decision to evacuate through hostile territory, I could feel my father's entire understanding of my military career shifting behind me. "Your tactical decision to utilize local assets and execute an unauthorized evacuation route saved 7 lives, the general continued. "Your leadership under fire, carrying a wounded soldier for 3 miles while coordinating extraction, demonstrates the kind of courage we expect from our finest officers." The room was completely silent except for the general's voice, but I was hyper-aware of my father's presence just a few feet behind me. I could almost feel his confusion transforming into something else. Understanding, maybe even pride. For years he'd seen my military service as a rebellion against his wishes, a phase I'd eventually outgrow. He'd never asked about my deployments, never wanted to hear about the soldiers under my command or the missions that kept me awake at night. Now he was learning about the most defining moment of my military career from a 3-star general in front of a room full of strangers. The irony was crushing. All those family dinners where he'd changed the subject when I tried to talk about my work. All those times he'd introduced me to his old military friends as my daughter who's playing soldier. All those moments when I desperately wanted his approval. His recognition that I was carrying on the Mitchell family tradition with honor. And here it was, finally, validation of my service, recognition of my courage, happening in the most public way possible, while he sat in stunned silence, realizing that he'd completely misjudged his own daughter. General Morrison reached for the Silver Star, and I knew that in a few moments, everything between my father and me would change. Forever. As General Morrison pinned the Silver Star to my chest, her words continued to fill the auditorium with details I'd never shared with anyone, especially not my father. Captain Mitchell's actions didn't end with the evacuation. When Sergeant Rodriguez went into cardiac arrest during the extraction, she performed field surgery with nothing but a combat medic kit and a flashlight, keeping him alive until they reached the forward operating base. I felt my breath catch. That part hadn't been in any of the reports I'd seen. The classified nature of the operation meant that even I didn't know how much the review board had uncovered about that night. Rodriguez had flatlined twice during our escape, and I'd made decisions that went far beyond my training, improvised procedures that could have killed him if I'd been wrong. Behind me, I heard my stepmother whisper urgently to my father, "James, did you know about any of this?" His response was barely audible. "No, I had no idea." The weight of that admission hit me harder than any enemy fire I'd faced. My own father, a decorated colonel who'd spent 30 years in the Army, had no idea that his daughter had been conducting classified operations, making life-and-death decisions, leading soldiers in combat. The distance between us suddenly felt like more than just emotional. It felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been trying to prove to him. General Morrison stepped back, and I executed a perfect about-face, finally able to see my father's expression fully. The confusion had been replaced by something more complex. Shock, yes, but also what looked like grief. Not grief for loss, but grief for time wasted, opportunities missed. Understanding that had come too late. But as I began to walk back toward my seat, something unexpected happened. My father stood up. Not the polite rising that protocol demanded, but a sudden, almost involuntary movement that drew every eye in the room. For a moment, he just stared at me, this stranger who was his daughter, this soldier he'd never bothered to know. Then he did something that stunned everyone in the auditorium, including me. He saluted. It wasn't the casual salute of retirement ceremonies or formal occasions. This was the crisp, precise salute of one soldier acknowledging another, of a colonel recognizing a captain's exceptional service. The salute he'd never given me, not once in 8 years of military service, because he'd never seen me as a real soldier. The room held its breath. Military protocol was complex in situations like this. He was retired. I was active duty. We were father and daughter, and we were in a mixed civilian-military setting. But protocol didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that Colonel James Mitchell was finally saluting Captain Sarah Mitchell, not as his daughter, but as a fellow warrior. I returned his salute, my hand steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. 8 years of disappointment, of feeling invisible, of carrying the weight of his disapproval, while trying to honor the same uniform he'd worn with pride. 8 years of wondering if I'd ever be good enough, strong enough, brave enough to earn his respect. But as I held that salute, looking into my father's eyes across the silent auditorium, I realized something that changed everything. The problem had never been about proving myself worthy of his respect. The problem was that he'd been so afraid of losing me to the same dangers he'd faced that he'd refused to see the soldier I'd become. His salute wasn't just acknowledgement. It was an apology, an admission that he'd been wrong, that his fear had blinded him to my courage, that his disappointment had been misplaced. And in that moment, with General Morrison watching and the entire auditorium as witnesses, my father finally saw me for who I really was. But I also saw something else in his eyes that made my stomach drop, pride mixed with terror, because now he understood exactly what I'd been risking, exactly what I'd been through, and exactly how close he'd come to losing me forever. The applause that followed felt like it lasted forever, but it ended all too quickly. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, I watched my father make his way toward me through the crowd. For the first time in years, I actually wanted to talk to him, to bridge the gap that had seemed insurmountable just an hour ago. But before he could reach me, General Morrison intercepted me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Captain Mitchell, I need to speak with you privately. There's been a development." The tone in her voice made my blood run cold. In the military, developments delivered by generals were rarely good news. I glanced over her shoulder to see my father still pushing through the crowd, his face showing an urgency I'd never seen before, as if he was afraid I might disappear before he could apologize for 8 years of dismissal. "Of course, ma'am," I replied, following her toward a side exit. I caught my father's eye and held up one finger, mouthing, "1 minute." He nodded, but I could see the concern creeping into his expression. The general led me to a small conference room where 2 men in suits were waiting. The moment I saw them, my heart sank. CIA. This wasn't about Syria anymore. This was about something new, something that was about to shatter the fragile reconciliation I'd just experienced with my father. "Captain, I'm Agent Harrison," the older man said. "We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Your linguistic skills and your experience in the Middle East make you uniquely qualified for a mission we need to launch within the next 48 hours. Ma'am, I just received the Silver Star. I was hoping for some leave time," I began, but General Morrison cut me off. "This is classified at the highest levels, Captain. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room." She paused, her expression grave. 3 days ago, we lost contact with a deep-cover operative in Damascus. Intelligence suggests he's been compromised and is being held by a faction we've been tracking for months. The window for extraction is closing rapidly. My stomach dropped. Another classified mission. Another deployment I couldn't discuss with anyone, especially not with my father, who had just discovered what my previous, classified mission had really entailed. The mission parameters are similar to your Syria operation. Agent Harrison continued. Small team, high risk, no official support if things go wrong. But this operative has intelligence that could prevent a major terrorist attack on American soil. We need someone who can think on their feet, someone who's proven they can make impossible decisions under pressure. I thought about my father waiting outside, probably rehearsing the apology he'd never learned how to give. I thought about my stepmother, who'd looked genuinely moved by the ceremony. I thought about all the family dinners I'd missed, all the conversations we'd never had, all the bridges I'd never built because of missions exactly like this one. When do I leave? I asked, already knowing I had no choice. Tonight. The transport leaves at 2100 hours. The words hit me like a physical blow. Tonight. I had maybe 6 hours to somehow explain to my father that just as we'd found our way back to each other, I was disappearing again into a world he couldn't follow, couldn't understand, and couldn't protect me from. General Morrison must have seen the conflict in my face. Captain, I know the timing is difficult, but you've already proven you're willing to risk everything for your fellow soldiers. This operative has a family too, a wife and 2 young children, who think he's working as a translator for the State Department. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of duty crushing any hope I'd had for repairing my relationship with my father. How could I explain that the daughter he'd just learned to respect was about to vanish again into another classified mission? How could I tell him that the Silver Star ceremony might be the last time he ever saw me alive? When I opened my eyes, I knew what I had to do. The hardest part wouldn't be the mission itself. It would be walking back into that auditorium and breaking my father's heart all over again, just when we'd finally found each other. The walk back to the auditorium felt like a death march. Through the glass doors, I could see my father pacing near the front row, checking his watch every few seconds. My stepmother was sitting quietly, probably trying to process everything she'd just witnessed. The contrast between their patient waiting and what I was about to tell them felt like a cruel joke. I paused just outside the doors, my hand on the handle trying to find the words that didn't exist. How do you tell your father that you've finally earned his respect only to immediately prove why he was right to worry all along? How do you explain that duty sometimes demands sacrificing the very relationships you've been fighting to save? But as I stood there, something shifted in my perspective. For 8 years, I'd been seeking his approval while hiding the very things that made me worthy of it. I'd compartmentalized my military life, keeping him at arm's length from the dangers I faced, the decisions I made, the soldiers who depended on me. Maybe it was time for complete honesty, even if it terrified him. When I finally walked through those doors, my father's face lit up with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure, uncomplicated pride mixed with what looked like relief. He'd been afraid I might leave without giving him the chance to apologize. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you." "Dad, we need to talk," I interrupted gently. "Somewhere private." The urgency in my tone must have registered, because his expression immediately shifted to concern. We found an empty classroom down the hall, and I closed the door behind us. For a moment, we just stood there, 2 soldiers in a small room, finally seeing each other clearly. "I'm proud of you," he said before I could speak. I should have said that years ago. I should have asked about your deployments, your missions, your soldiers. I was so afraid of losing you to the same war that almost killed me that I refused to see the incredible officer you'd become. His words hit me harder than I'd expected. This was the conversation I'd dreamed of having for 8 years, and now I had to cut it short with news that would validate every fear he'd ever had about my service. "Dad, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I began, sitting down across from him. "In about 5 hours, I'm leaving for another classified mission. I can't tell you where, I can't tell you what, and I can't tell you when I'll be back." I watched the color drain from his face as the implications sank in. He'd just discovered what Syria had really been, and now I was telling him there was another Syria waiting. "The timing is horrible," I continued. "I know that, but there's an operative in trouble, and I'm the best qualified person to bring him home. Just like Rodriguez, just like the others in Syria. I can't abandon him." My father was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with conflicting emotions. The proud colonel who understood duty and sacrifice was warring with the terrified father who'd just realized how much danger his daughter regularly faced. "How long have you been doing missions like this?" he asked finally. "Since my second deployment. I've been part of a joint task force for specialized operations. High risk, high value targets, situations that require improvisation." He closed his eyes, probably calculating how many times I'd been in mortal danger while he was treating my career like a phase I'd outgrow. "I need you to understand something, Dad," I said, leaning forward. "I'm good at this. Not just competent, I'm exceptional. The soldiers under my command trust me because I've earned it. The generals who select me for these missions know I'll bring everyone home, even when the odds are impossible." When he opened his eyes, I saw something I'd never expected. Acceptance mixed with a fierce, protective pride. The same look he'd had when he taught me to shoot, when he'd watched me graduate from West Point, when he'd tried to talk me out of enlisting because he knew exactly how dangerous it would be. "Then bring yourself home too," he said quietly, "because I just found my daughter again, and I'm not ready to lose her." The mission briefing had been clinical. Extract operative Phoenix from a safe house in Damascus that was no longer safe. Intelligence suggested he'd been compromised and had maybe 12 hours before his cover was completely blown. "Simple extraction," they said. "Get in, get him out, disappear." Nothing about it had been simple. We'd been on the ground for 6 hours when everything went sideways. The safe house was already under surveillance, and Phoenix wasn't there. Our local contact, a nervous kid who couldn't have been older than 20, led us through narrow alleyways to a backup location where Phoenix was supposedly hiding. But when we arrived at the bombed-out apartment building, we found him barely conscious, beaten, and with a bullet wound in his shoulder. "They know about the attack," he whispered as I worked to stop the bleeding. "Container ship, Norfolk Port, 3 days. Chemical weapons." The intelligence he'd gathered was even more critical than we'd been told. This wasn't just about extracting one operative. This was about preventing a terrorist attack that could kill thousands of Americans. But Phoenix was in no condition to move. Our extraction route had been compromised, and I could hear vehicles approaching from multiple directions. In that moment, crouched in a destroyed apartment with enemy forces closing in, I felt the weight of every decision I'd ever made as a soldier. Syria had taught me that sometimes the only way forward was through impossible choices. My father's years of training had prepared me for tactical thinking under pressure, but this required something more. The kind of leadership that meant accepting responsibility for outcomes I couldn't control. "Rodriguez, take Phoenix and head for the secondary extraction point," I ordered my sergeant, the same man whose life I'd saved in Syria. "I'm going to buy you time." "Ma'am, we don't leave anyone behind," Rodriguez replied, echoing the creed that had guided every mission we'd run together. "You're not leaving me behind," I said, checking my ammunition. "You're following my orders. Get him to that extraction point and radio for immediate evac. That intelligence dies with him if we don't get him out." The sound of boots on stairs was getting closer. I could hear voices in Arabic, coordinated and professional. This wasn't a random patrol. They'd tracked us here, which meant our entire operation had been compromised from the start. I made the decision that would either save my team or get us all killed. Instead of trying to escape, I was going to give them exactly what they were looking for. Me. Moving to the opposite end of the building, I started making noise, deliberately drawing their attention away from Rodriguez and Phoenix. I fired several rounds through a window, then immediately changed position, creating the impression of a larger force. The tactics my father had drilled into me during childhood war games suddenly became life-and-death reality. For 20 minutes, I played a deadly game of cat and mouse through the ruins of that building. Every lesson from Syria, every training exercise, every moment of tactical instruction from my father's military legacy came together in a symphony of survival. I used the building's layout to my advantage, creating choke points, forcing them to split their forces, buying precious minutes for my team to escape. When I finally heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors, I knew Rodriguez had made it to the extraction point. Phoenix would live to deliver his intelligence, and thousands of American lives would be saved. But I was still trapped in a building surrounded by hostile forces, with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. That's when my father's voice echoed in my memory from a training exercise years ago. Sometimes the best tactical decision is the one your enemy doesn't expect. Instead of trying to fight my way out, I surrendered. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the smartest. They wanted me alive for interrogation, which meant I had time. Time for extraction, time for rescue, time for the intelligence Phoenix carried to reach the people who could stop the attack. 3 days later, a joint special operations team pulled me out of a detention facility outside Damascus. By then, the container ship had been intercepted, the chemical weapons secured, and the terrorist cell dismantled. Phoenix's intelligence had been accurate, and thousands of lives had been saved. But more importantly, I'd proven something to myself that I'd been trying to prove to my father for years. That courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about making the right decision even when you're terrified of the consequences. The debriefing took 3 weeks, but the conversation with my father took 3 minutes. He was waiting for me at the airport when I finally made it home, looking older than when I'd left, but somehow more at peace. The fear was still there in his eyes, but it was tempered by something stronger, respect that had been tested by absence and proven genuine. The news said there was a terrorist plot that was stopped, he said as we walked to his car. Chemical weapons, thousands of lives saved. They didn't mention any names, but you knew, I finished for him. He nodded slowly. I knew my daughter was out there somewhere, making impossible decisions and bringing people home. He paused at the car door, looking at me with an expression I'd waited my entire military career to see. I also knew she'd find a way to come home, too, because that's who she is. That's who she's always been. The drive to his house was different than any we'd shared before. Instead of awkward silence or surface-level conversation, he asked real questions about my service, my soldiers, my missions. Not for details I couldn't share, but for the things that mattered. How I made decisions under pressure, what kept me grounded in chaos, how I'd learned to lead when leadership meant risking everything. For the first time in 8 years, I felt like I was talking to a fellow soldier instead of a disappointed father. You know what the hardest part was? I told him as we sat on his back porch that evening. It wasn't the danger or the classified nature of the work. It was feeling like I had to prove myself worthy of something you'd already given me. Your legacy, your values, your training. I spent so much time trying to earn your respect that I almost forgot I already had your love. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. I was terrified of losing you to the same war that took so many of my friends, he finally said. So I tried to push you away from it, never realizing that you weren't running toward danger. You were running toward purpose, the same purpose that drove me for 30 years. I'm not done yet, I warned him. There will be other missions, other classified deployments. I can't promise I'll always come home, but I can promise I'll always fight to come home. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. Then I'll be here when you do, and I'll stop worrying about whether you're good enough for this job and start being proud that this job was lucky enough to get you. 6 months later, I'm preparing for another deployment, but everything has changed. My father calls regularly now, not to check up on me, but to share stories from his own service, to offer advice when I face difficult decisions, to remind me that the Mitchell family tradition isn't just about wearing the uniform. It's about wearing it with honor. The silver star sits in a place of honor in my apartment, but it's not the medal that matters most to me. It's the memory of my father's salute, the moment when he finally saw me as the soldier I'd always been. Looking back on this journey, I realize that sometimes the battles we fight aren't just against external enemies. They're against the limitations others place on us, the expectations that try to define us, the voices that tell us we're not enough. But if you stay true to your purpose, if you keep fighting for what matters, eventually the world sees you for who you really are. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you had to prove yourself worthy of respect you'd already earned, I'd love to hear about it. Hit that subscribe button and share your own stories of overcoming doubt and finding your purpose. Sometimes we all need reminding that we're stronger than we know and that the people who matter most are worth fighting for. What's your story of proving them wrong?